Okay, today I'm going to kind of do the essentials of Black Marxism. So I'm actually going to do a shorter lecture today. That way I won't open a series of cans of worms. Initially, that's why it was sort of a mix-up on the syllabus. Initially, I was going to have the exam today. Then a series of circumstances occurred such that I needed to move it. Then I realized, oh no, I'm going to have to do some part of Black Marxism. So I'm going to do kind of the basic introduction you'll need to do any of the sort of questions on the exam. People have sent me a lot of emails about the exam. What I can say about it is that what I really want you to be able to do is connect people, events, organizations to concepts like radical egalitarianism, Black nationalism. This isn't a history course. I don't want you shouldn't have to memorize dates. I haven't asked you. I don't know on what date W.E. Du Bois was born. I couldn't tell you. I don't expect you either. I do know Malcolm X's birthday, but that's a whole other thing. There's a friend of mine that always emails me to say, "Happy birthday, Malcolm X," on Malcolm's birthday. So there's a little joke about that, and if he ever watches this, he'll get it and laugh. Are there any questions about the exam? So we'll start at 9. It's about 20 to 25 questions, so it should go pretty quick. It's not overly complicated. I'm going to do a little experiment. I want to give you guys an exam that I gave 10 years ago. And if you can find anyone that took the class 10 years ago, then you guys have a good chance at it, but I doubt if you can. So I haven't dusted it off since, but we'll see. It's a little experiment I want to do to test something. So today I'm going to talk about Black Marxism, and one of the things, if we sort of understood, we talked a significant amount last class about, in particular, we talked a lot about the revolutionary nationalist movements, and that there were Black nationalists who adopted broad tenets of Marxism and so in some ways, in many ways, the sort of boundaries between revolutionary nationalism and Black Marxism are extremely permeable, because in fact, frequently, as you saw a little bit in your readings, what marks Black Marxism as Black is that they, rather than a lot of orthodox Marxists who see race as just a category that's really just simply about class oppression, Black Marxists see a particular role that race plays in promoting inequality, but also a particular role that race and racial nationalism, in fact, might play in Black liberation. The pictures you see before you are Paul Robeson, singer, intellectual, actor, Cornel West, below him, intellectual professor, A. Philip Randolph, a union leader, the leader of the activist Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Angela Davis, former UCLA professor, now at UC Santa Cruz, but also an activist. These are all faces of people who were sort of African Americans and come in what I would call an African American radical tradition, radical meaning a Marxist framework. So to quote Angela Davis here, racism is in the first place is a weapon used by the wealthy to increase the profits they bring in by paying Black workers less. And so here you see a kind of traditionally Marxist turn in which the racism is not simply a product of psychological malice, but is a tool used by the ruling capitalist class to enhance profits or to manage their or to increase their wealth. So that is a kind of Marxist analysis of slavery, is that slavery wasn't necessarily about racism, but was principally about the exploitation of labor, right? And the planter class that was developing the international capitalist system needed cheap and available labor in order to increase production, et cetera. And so hence you got slavery. And that in some ways, in that kind of analysis, what happens is that the racism within it becomes a kind of product of simply becomes a justification to maintain the overall perspective of class exploitation and the exploitation of labor. So, in the central analysis of Marxism is that there's a capitalist system. The capitalist system is based on the alienation of labor, right? You don't own what you produce. The owner of the factory or whatever owns what you produce. And so therefore, the central conflict is between workers and bourgeois capital, or those that own the means of production. And so as a result, ultimately, right, Marx argues that system will yield to ultimately revolution, right? The lumpen proletariat won't take it anymore. They're going to resist being alienated from their capital, and they'll overturn it, and there'll be a communist revolution where the workers themselves own the means of production, right? That's the sort of basic line. And so Angela Davis here and many black intellectuals and activists have adopted the perspective that this is at least a significant part of the analysis of understanding both the position of African Americans in the United States and as well as black people around the world, but is also a significant way in which, if one adopts a Marxist point of view, it's a significant way to craft an alternative or a way to challenge that exploitation. So if one adopts a Marxist analysis, the problem is not just about sort of eliminating racism or being able to sit at a lunch counter or having civil rights. A central problem is the capitalist system itself, right? It's inherent exploitation. It's designed to maintain surplus labor and African Americans in levels of poverty, et cetera, and to exploit their labor. So in that sense, nothing short in this sense, right? When we talked about even the sort of radical egalitarians, but also various strains of black nationalism like Garveyism, who either sought to use capitalism or didn't see capitalism itself as inherently bad. Marxism begins with a kind of analysis that the central problem, capitalism isn't just a problem that's a product of racism because capitalism is used in a racist way, so all we have to do is sort of fix racism. Capitalism is fine. Capitalism is essentially the problem. Capitalism creates the sort of predicate to exploit labor. And this sort of, in the kind of black Marxist analysis, you would see that, one might even engage, say, for instance, the immigration debate by saying, right, the problem and the fight against legalization of migrants isn't so much about sort of is a kind of fiction created by capitalists, because really what capitalists want is they want undocumented people that are deportable, but they have no intent to deport them, because they want a class of people after the civil rights movement, when they could no longer so easily exploit black labor because blacks gained their rights, et cetera, were willing to organize and challenge it. They want a pool of laborers that are exploitable. And so the threat of deportation creates a class of people that are therefore exploitable in a way that others, U.S. citizens, et cetera, are not. So in that sense, a kind of Marxist analysis, even sort of black Marxist analysis of that is that the sort of ongoing And so in some ways, right, the racism is sold and nativism is sold to white and sometimes black working classes in order to perpetuate the sort of fiction that, oh, the system is working to protect the U.S. from the undocumented, et cetera, and cultural issues, et cetera. But really, that really all the while the capitalists just want this exploitable labor, and they want more immigration controls without actually ever deporting people because they want them to live in fear. So that they won't organize, they won't join unions, they won't challenge the fact that they're being exploited or paid below minimum wages or have deplorable working conditions. And they would go back and say that during Jim Crow, the sharecropping system, systems in various factories, et cetera, this is exactly the case when African Americans didn't necessarily have their rights. So, but one of the things is A. Philip Randolph also says salvation for a race, nation, or class must come from within. And so even within black Marxists, while they've had this Marxist analysis, they've also been willing to sort of think about the sort of interaction between race and class and nation. And that you can't sort of always entirely separate them. And that's where you get the kind of permeable boundary between revolutionary nationalists and black Marxists. And that they've also been willing to think about sort of racial liberation. And they don't just see the working class as racially undifferentiated. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So if we think about black radicalism, it's been rediscovered and reinvented by different generations. It has also been inspired by revolutions in places like in the Cuban Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Many Caribbeans many of the early sort of writers were inspired by the Haitian Revolution, by Chinese communism, the overthrow of the French in Algeria, and the anti-colonial struggle in Ghana. So therefore, many of the people who have profoundly influenced have been Chinese Chairman Mao, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Che's on there twice, Kwame Nkrumah, Toussaint Louverture, who led the rebellion in Haiti, and Martinican writer, intellectual, psychologist, and activist who participated in the Algerian Revolution, Frantz Fanon, are sort of critical sort of leaders in the intellectual movement of what we call black Marxism. And if you notice, black Marxism, as in many of Marxism, has a kind of internationalist flavor to it, much more so than kind of the radical egalitarian strain. Well, at least somewhat. I mean, we saw earlier the King's engagement with Gandhi and others, but here we see a kind of engagement in particular with a series of thinkers and activists and leaders outside of the U.S. Many black radicals emerged from either liberal and or nationalist organizations. That is, many of them start off as kind of radical egalitarians and decide ultimately that, well, the problem is capitalism, that system's messed up, or they're nationalists, and eventually they sort of evolve into thinking Marxism. And a significant number of black Marxists are located in and around the labor movement. In particular, we noted that A. Philip Randolph was the president of one of the first international unions that organized black workers, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And I don't know if we saw that scene in Malcolm X, but there's actually one point where actually Malcolm X was a sleeping car porter. He worked as a sleeping car porter, and there's an incident where the sleeping car porters were the people who used to serve riders on the train that traveled in the state. And so the sleeping car porters were a group of men, almost all of them African American, who provided the basic kind of first class service. You know, they would bring you tea and drinks and food, etc., make sure you're comfortable. Basically, like they were sort of stewards or the equivalent of kind of flight attendants today for the large interstate train travel. They were all African American, almost overwhelmingly, And one of the things was that in order, there was kind of an agreement, and the agreement was so that they would not be called by sort of undignified names, that they would all be called George. So all of them were referred to as George by whoever it was. So if you address your sleeping car porter, because whites would not refer to blacks as Mr. So-and-so or Sir, right? That was conferring too much respect on them. And then, well, you didn't want them to call them boy or anything like that. That was disrespectful. So the agreement would be that the standard name of reference for all sleeping car porters would be George. So there's that also. There's a film about A. Philip Randolph. I think it was done by HBO or something like that. It starred Andre Brower, another graduate of St. Ignatius College Prep in Chicago. And it was entitled, I think it was called 10,000 Men Named George, and about their struggle to form a union, and also to form a union against but to negotiate with the Pullman Company, but also A. Phillips Randolph's struggle to, one of the things that's always sort of thwarted kind of Marxist coalitions, in particular labor to develop in the U.S., is that white workers and frequently even unionized workers have often resisted the idea of blacks being able to organize or blacks being able to join the union that they participate in. So one of the things that has often sort of thwarted the development of working class coalitions is that working class whites have frequently chosen their racial privilege or their whiteness above their sort of class interests. So in that sense, there has been opportunities for kinds of manipulations, right? So sometimes black workers or Latino workers are used, in many cases were historically used before they could organize, as things like as strike breakers, et cetera. But that was also facilitated by the fact that they would not allow those workers to join the union. So this is one of the things that happened over time. So if we think about the major organizations, sort of Marxist organizations, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, there's one important organization that existed in Harlem in the 1920s. It was called the African Blood Brotherhood. It was headed by, as well, it was a contemporary with the Garvey organization, and had a lot of both sort of conflicts but also sort of interactions with the Garvey movement. And it was headed by another West Indian by the name of W.A. Domingo. And there was a series of, during the 1920s, there was a lot of black radical organizing and interaction with Marxism, particularly by a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers. There was a series of newspapers and activities that argued for socialism. The leading black newspaper in Harlem, the Amsterdam News, had an explicitly socialist Marxist point of view. There were also papers and magazines like The Messenger and The Emancipator. So these organizations were ones that were, these organizations and papers were ones that were designed around a kind of Marxist ethos, and frequently were plugged in and connected to the Communist International. So that is, they were coordinated in part, both so even including many of the artists and writers that participated in the Harlem Renaissance movement and in the broader international movement that articulated with the Harlem Renaissance, the Negritude movement, were convened at things at conferences that were convened by the Communist International. And so they were engaged in both sort of what they considered to be black cultural production and struggles against racism, but as part of a global struggle against capitalism. And so a lot of these sort of newspapers, et cetera, in the 1920s, another organization, CPUSA, or the Communist Party USA, was a kind of central organization. And the Communist Party USA, for the longest time, was one of the, along with the NAACP, was one of the only interracial organizations in the United States. The Communist Party USA was willing, accepted black members, And as I go, I'll explain to you some of the difficulties. And Communist Party USA saw itself as getting involved. It was one of the few organizations, in particular. So if we think about in the sort of the Scottsboro case, where in the 20s and 30s, where a series of young African American men were accused of raping a white woman on the train. It turned out she actually later recanted. Actually, the woman who they were sentenced to death. The woman who was actually involved actually later ended up marrying a black man, ironically enough. And this was a sort of major case. The NAACP didn't want to go anywhere near it. The only organization that was willing to get involved was the Communist Party USA in defense of them. So the Communist Party USA, at various points in time, saw the struggle against racial inequality, and particularly in the South, as a central sort of thing to fight, not just to fight racial oppression, but to be able to set up the kind of conditions in which one could bring working class or workers of all races together. And in fact, but a series of kind of controversies began to sort of undermine Communist Party USA. One of them was when Lenin released the idea of that blacks represented a nation within an oppressed nation within a nation. This is Lenin from Russia. And it's interesting to know that Lenin himself actually wrote about the situation of blacks in the United States as being a sort of super oppressed group. That is, the situation of blacks in the U.S. has not just been sort of the provenance of people within the context of the U.S. It was of particularly interest to the Soviets, both in the sort of 20s and 30s, but as well substantially during the Cold War, when the Soviets used the fact of Jim Crow and American oppression to embarrass the U.S. on the international stage. In fact, the Soviets used a lot of propaganda of Jim Crow and racial discrimination when approaching and trying to get members of the developing world, in particular South Asia and Africa, to align with the Soviet Union. And in fact, this scared the United States, and in part some people argue that Brown versus Board of Education was not so much because of internal pressure, but because of the fact that we were beginning to lose the next phase in the Cold War after World War II, when it became for the hearts and minds and people in this so-called developing world. Because they would show, they would go to Sri Lanka or Indonesia and show people images of lynchings, or in Africa and show images of lynchings and the Soviets would talk about Jim Crow and say, this is what capitalism, this is what the U.S. brings you. They're saying that they're your friends, but this is what they really think of you. And in fact, there's a former student of mine wrote an amazing dissertation about this. There was a communique from a State Department official in South Asia, and he's writing about the use of Soviet propaganda about racism in recruiting people in the country to support aligning with the Soviets rather than the U.S. And he ends the communique with what led to a series of tours by black athletes and musicians to show that the United States really cared about black culture, et cetera. But he ends the communique with, "We need the niggers," in the State Department communique, which is, we need some of our black citizens to come here and sort of smooth this over and show that we aren't as racist as we are. Ironically, the terminology he used in the sort of private State Department communique confirmed what he really did sort of think of the U.S.'s black citizens. So CPUSA particularly worked with the Soviet International, but often sort of ran afoul of it in that at times, while the CPUSA was one of the leading multiracial organizations, it also continuously struggled with whether or not their central aim was to deal with sort of racism as a prelude to building sort of worker coalitions, or whether really what they just needed to focus on primarily was trying to organize and get the white working class to follow the Marxist agenda. And then somehow anti-racism would come later. And so this was one of the major struggles that led many, in general, they tended to focus on the idea that their focus was, and the union movement has had this problem as well, that really their focus is to convince the white working class to work in their class interests, but that hopefully sort of racism would wither away as they became more class conscious, rather than blacks who wanted to make racism the central issue, because they saw it as the central barrier to developing working class coalitions. And you actually saw a resurrection of some of this in the of some of this kind of debate in the last election cycle, when one of the heads of the AFL-CIO, a guy by the name of Richard Trumka, if you can catch it online, he goes and gives these sort of speeches to white working class union members in the sort of middle part of the country through Appalachia and places like that. And he basically goes and makes the argument that if you don't vote for Barack Obama because he's black, you're giving up your real class interests, right? You're voting against your class interests. You're choosing your racism over your real pocketbook interests. And he says, there's only one bad reason not to vote for Barack Obama, and that's because he's black. And so he goes and talks about all these sort of, very deeply involved union members who are having these reservations about voting for a black man for president, despite the fact that they're unhappy with Republican policies, in particular sort of Republican anti-trade union policies. And so this kind of debate came up again in the 2008 election, but it's been a consistent debate throughout the 20s, throughout the 30s, consistently about what are the sort of potential connections between working class actors in the United States, particularly white actors, and what role does racism play in trying to forge a coalition of poor and working class people. Ultimately, Communist CPUSA is undermined by the McCarthy movement that begins to attack anybody who has any relationship to sort of communist thought. One of the things is that era, we see the Hollywood blacklisting, of which you guys might be familiar with. This happens in the sort of 40s. And that era begins to creates a way in which a kind of separation, a way in which black organizations like the NAACP see that, given the sort of realities of the Cold War, and in order to forge forward, they need to purge communists or people who sympathize with sort of communism or criticize capitalism. They actually need to purge them from their organizations. So people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped start the NAACP, but who had, by the time the 40s rolls around, drifted with World War II and his sort of disappointment over the things that came out of that, had drifted into radicalism in the form of communism, actually gets purged out of the NAACP himself during the McCarthy era. People like Paul Robeson and others. One of the sort of principal actors in terms of getting communists out of organizations like the NAACP are people like who became Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who throughout his life, while sort of fighting on the radical egalitarian front within the United States, took an explicitly anti-communist view, both on the international stage, but as well as within black organizations. And so people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson gets blacklisted. He can't perform within the United States, and others. W.E.B. Du Bois eventually, as a result of being blacklisted, actually leaves the U.S. And lives the last years of his life in Ghana. And so as a result, actually, when the sort of the organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in its early, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that we know as the central radical egalitarian organizations that pushed the civil rights movement in the late 40s and 50s up through parts of the 60s and until when you see the Black Panther Party and some other organizations emerge, as well as I'll talk a little bit about Martin Luther King. Those organizations are actually, particularly on the question of capitalism, are much more conservative than the sort of general black consensus in the 20s and 30s, right? McCarthyism creates a kind of bargain in black political thought, or a practical bargain, which is, okay, we may reform the system of racial inequality and offer civil rights, but you guys have to get rid of the communists, right? You can't question capitalism within the context of your organizations. You even saw that a little bit in some of King's speeches, where he somewhat goes out of his way to kind of distance himself from being a Marxist. One problem with that is frequently, because of the Scottsboro case or anything, in particular, both sort of Southern leaders, but others, as well as J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, frequently equated working for racial equality with communist views or organizing. So frequently, a lot of the times, some of the attacks on organizers in the South fighting for racial equality, civil rights activists, even though these organizations had explicitly purged communists from their organizations, many of them were branded as communists or Marxists because, talking about equality, talking about the kinds of things that radical egalitarians talk about can be sort of wrongly interpreted as being sort of communist. So one of the things is that, so if you look up sort of Jesse Helms, the former senator from North Carolina, his discussion of why the U.S. Shouldn't have a Martin Luther King holiday. Jesse Helms goes on and, on the floor of the Senate, gives a whole speech about how Martin Luther King Jr. was an anti-American communist, and that to lionize him and to create a holiday for him in that sense would sort of be is anti-American in and of itself, right? And that was the kind of sort of basic analysis. So any struggle for racial equality was kind of equated with communist organizing or communist sympathies by many of these groups. But at the same time, Communist Party USA was at various points, though it was under fire during the McCarthy era and went through the sort of Hollywood blacklisting, et cetera, Communist Party USA was at the same time ambivalent about its embrace of black workers and black issues because they saw it as potentially distancing themselves from the white working class. And as a result of all this, I mean, if you think about the sort of McCarthy era where artists and writers and things like that were blacklisted, like if you watch some of like the old, films these days, rarely have a kind of, a lot of movies coming out of Hollywood in the sort of 20s and 30s had a kind of veneer of a discussion around class conflict. Even films like up until 40s and 50s, even films like Spartacus, right? Spartacus has a kind of class conflict. The people who are captured as gladiators or slaves, they're trying to resist their enslavement, et cetera. There's a kind of class conflict. You actually see, as a result of the McCarthy era, not only does kind of radicalism get purged from black organizations, but you also see Hollywood takes a turn away from movies that depict class conflict in any meaningful way. I can give you a beautiful example. So was it Will Smith's film, The Pursuit of Happiness, right? So the sort of veneer of the film is that Will Smith is poor, homeless, on the verge of homelessness, but he's very smart, and so his thing is he wants to become, he's a single dad, he wants to become a stockbroker, right? And so his idea is that if I'm just smart enough, right, the meritocracy will reward me and I will make it in the capitalist system. And it ends with the sort of true story that the guy made a couple of $1 million, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So the film doesn't depict class conflict, right? It's about sort of meritocracy and class envy, in that you'll get there if you just work hard. There are rarely films made in the United States. So they even think about another film that could have been used to sort of depict class conflict, which is sort of Titanic, right? It's kind of anachronistic. I guess you guys don't watch this stuff anymore. It was big a few years ago, but so Leonardo DiCaprio is like the poor guy on the ship, right? And actually, I mean, they don't make a big deal about it, but like all the poor people end up dying, right? And the rich people get lifeboats. But at the same time, right, his route is by being a kind of Cinderella, right? Like he gets to, through his relationship, he gets to sort of dress up and play the kind of Cinderella story of interacting with the sort of rich first class passengers on the ship, and he gets to stand up at the front of the thing, and I'm the king of the world and all that wonderful stuff. But so films that depict a kind of both sort of working class life and or class conflict, film, TV shows, etc., are kind of purged from sort of Hollywood's lexicon, right? We don't talk about class and inequality in those ways, and the difficulties. There's only a few shows. For instance, Roseanne Barr's show does a little bit of that happens in the past. Fred Sanford's show, Good Times, does a little bit about a significant amount about sort of race and class. But for the most part, right, I mean, you can even think about sort of the Cosby Show, right? There's a black family living in a 2-3 story townhouse in Manhattan. Dad's a obstetrician, doctor, mom's a big time attorney. There is no, they occasionally deal with sort of questions of racism, but the sort of life of the Cosby Show, which was the most popular show in the 1980s, doesn't depict the kind of a kind of realistic vision of how most Americans live or what their class like. I mean, even if you watch, for instance, Friends, right? Like how many even single white folks living in Manhattan who work in coffee shops live in apartments that large, right? They don't. Yeah. Yeah, Fresh Prince also, right? Like the sort of class conflict in Fresh Prince is not about sort of inequality and trying to get there and make it, and the difficulties of that, because he's actually sort of made it, right? Because his mom ships him out to Bel Air. It's all about the conflict of the cultures, right? Between sort of an upper middle class black culture and the kind of working class black culture that the Fresh Prince or Jazzy Jeff comes out of. And so both in sort of black organizations, but also as a result of the McCarthy era and sort of popular culture, we've largely sort of cleansed our language of this discussion of class and inequality and exploitation. Yes. It was the most popular show in America. Well, I mean, so the wife they have 5 kids, but the wife is like a successful corporate lawyer, and they live in a very large home in Manhattan, and send all of them to private colleges, right? And ostensibly sort of pay for it out of their pockets. I mean, that's not a reality, right? There's no, so on one hand, right, I mean, you can see that Bill Cosby attempts to do a show that portrays black middle class and black professionals, educated black professionals who do exist, and portray them in a positive light and give a kind of voice to that. But it also becomes, it's a much more palatable show because you don't have to deal with a lot of the, particularly in the kind of Reagan era, right? This is the go-go 80s. This is the era of consumption and deregulation and everyone pulling themselves by their bootstraps. The show matched with that kind of ethos. Bill Cosby made a second show in the 90s where he was the head of a family and where he was actually a laid off, sort of semi-laid off kind of retired worker, where actually class issues were a significant problem, and that show was not nearly as successful. The other show, actually one show that's actually quite good about dealing with class issues and consistently does, is the Everybody Hates Chris. Is actually a really good show about, because Chris is in a sort of working class family. The dad has 2 jobs, and there's always a kind of discussion about their finances, their class aspirations, their aspirations for his education, and how they sort of balance all of that off. It's a much more kind of realistic portrait of what most sort of middle class black families faced in kind of the 1980s. It's almost, because he actually builds it in that era, which I guess was the era when Chris Rock was coming up, but it also is a kind of, if you think about that show as a kind of reworking of some of the themes. And it's one of the few shows that's explicitly about class. I mean, even think about even the shows that do sort of deal with class issues. It's always from the perspective of the kind of charity of the sort of very wealthy helping out the sort of lower class people. So like, the 90210s and the OCs of the world. And then now you have a whole, sort of shows about, the shows that we do about class nowadays are really more about conspicuous consumption than they are about real life. So, the housewives of Orange County and Atlanta, those kinds of shows, or the OC itself, really are shows about the kind of vacuousness, or even if My Sweet 16, right, where basically, these 16-year-olds have these sort of potlatches, right, where they or even the other sort of quote unquote reality shows, what is it, mega whatever weddings, or platinum weddings and all that kind of stuff. And it'll be interesting to see if, with the sort of changing economic conditions, whether people have less patience for that kind of stuff, right? Whether people decide, like, I think it's ridiculous that people are, doing this kind of stuff and spending this kind of money, and, the sort of vacuousness of their lives, et cetera. And so that's to say that, like, in part because of sort of race and class issues and McCarthyism, that kind of destroyed Communist Party USA, but also crippled Marxist influences within black organizations, in particular sort of mainstream black organizations, which frequently, like the NAACP wasn't itself a Marxist organization, but frequently a number of people in it might be involved in something like the African Blood Brotherhood or the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, are involved with the Amsterdam News and have Marxist sympathies, but they were forced to purge those people out. Later on, we've talked about the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense adopts a kind of mantra of being nationalist in form but socialist in action. They see themselves as an organization that has a Marxist ideology within the context of their revolutionary nationalist struggle. So just to go back, so the Soviets and the Communist Party USA, they offered the idea of black self-determination. Lenin even offers the idea that's connected with some forms of black nationalism, that particularly the Black Belt may be the place where one might locate a black nation. There's struggles within the Communist Party USA to what degree black cultural activities might be used in order to advance communist notions and ideas within black culture. You also have the issues in the southern United States with the Scottsboro Boys and Scottsboro, Alabama, being a part defended by the Communist Party, and you have these sort of questions of white workers, right? And one of the things we can think about is caste, as in racial divisions versus class, and that's been a significant. Some people have argued that the U.S. doesn't have a workers' party, right? That the U.S. does not have a workers' party because the political parties have been sort of organized around these sort of racial coalitions. And if you think about it, right, so if you looked at, if I were to show you an analysis of if I were to show you analysis of the last election, or in fact the last 5 or 6, right, the poorest white communities in America, throughout the South and Appalachia, largely the very poorest white communities largely voted overwhelmingly for Republicans, who generally don't produce a set of policies that are generally favorable to their economic interests. So if you think about the working class whites in Mississippi, Louisiana, West Virginia, in those places, right, the Republican Party isn't winning because of the big business Wall Street vote in those places. And what they've done is over time, the Southern strategy developed by the Republican Party involved using the question, first using the questions of civil rights, affirmative action, and then morphing into a sort of broader discourse of religious and cultural issues, but beginning first with the question of sort of race and the Southern way of life as meaning segregation as the central cultural war issue, has been the ways in which they've developed a kind of stranglehold on various versions of the white working class, and it's been about and using sort of coded racial language like crime, et cetera, in order to maintain that sort of thing. And so what that's prevented is that, and in responding to that, right, the sort of Bill Clinton version of the Democratic Party drifted to say, okay, so we can't win those people. What we're going to do is we're going to go after suburban white voters in places like Ohio and et cetera, who are professionals, who are technically adept, who have a different set of, who aren't in the manufacturing sector, who aren't minimum wage workers, but who might have a sort of different set of much more sort of moderate economic interests. And we're going to go after those set of voters and move the Democratic Party further to the center. In some ways, that was kind of the conflict between sort of Clinton and Obama in the primaries, and where Clinton also made sort of explicit appeals to saying, working class white voters aren't going to vote for this guy. He's black. We know how this works. I come from Arkansas. I've seen this before. You have to try and appeal to them. But one of the things is that both the election both the primary and the general election put these issues front and center. When Sarah Palin started talking about the real America, non-elite America, the droves of sort of poor black Latino people who overwhelmingly were voting for the now President-elect Obama didn't sort of count as far as that. Somehow they're constructed as elitists, or they're not real Americans. It's only the folks in sort of overwhelmingly white small towns in these places that really count, and who see patriotism and the sort of lens of the world through a sort of lens of kind of a culture and things of whiteness. So one of the things is that there's a kind of evolving discussion about the beginning of, so if the Southern strategy can't get enough white voters together in enough key states to defeat a guy named Barack Hussein Obama in a presidential election, then maybe that strategy doesn't work any longer. And then also, given the sort of current economic crisis, there's potentially an opportunity to begin to have the parties actually begin to organize on a much more kind of class-oriented basis, or at least a kind of class and ideology basis, with the party sort of hewing to class interest. The interesting part about it is that actually, though, as well, Senator Obama seemed to win, as long as they weren't white, he won the very poorest Americans. He also won the most wealthy ones. Because it's frequently the most wealthy who say, you know, I need to contribute something to kind of some social development because I benefit from it, right? I get roads that go to my factory. I get a range of different things. So it's a kind of interesting sort of set of things. And so you're actually probably going to see in the next couple of years and coming years a more overt discussion of class in American politics. Another issue is that, so in fact, that conflict has always existed, and it's been one of the sort of undoings of Communist Party USA. It's been one of the undoings of aspects of the labor movement, and in particular of developing a kind of a political party that's based mostly around issues of class, rather than, and in some ways, the sort of cultural wars, the debates about, you know, gay marriage and separation of church and state and abortion debates as sort of the central sort of things that we talk about frequently in politics for a long time, were a way to avoid these kinds of thorny economic issues and discussions of class. Also, who's middle class in America? Where does middle class stop? Right, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I would say that middle class stops before you get, like, I would use it by income. So before you get into like the 6-digit figures and you're able to be comfortable within your home and within with your family. That's where I would say middle class stops. You're becoming upper middle class and then you go into upper class.
Right. Hey, yeah.
I checked on I've done some research on that, and I've seen people define middle class as up to a family of 4, up to incomes of 60,000, up to incomes of just over 100,000, and still qualify as middle class.
My family makes 6 digits, and that is so it would still be middle class, and it feels like lower.
Go ahead.
It's more than just income too. You have to have a house, a wife, car, and dog.
If you're male, or if you're a lesbian, you'd have to have a wife. Yeah, I mean, so the thing is that middle class, right? So when John McCain gets asked what's middle class, he's like, well, up to like making $5 million a year, right? So, but the point is that people, all the way from people who make about, as a family income, like $25,000 to $40,000 a year, up to people who make in excess of 6 figures, all think of themselves as some version of middle class in America. Those people's life chances, what they can consume, what they can buy, where they live, are radically different. But so the concept of that we're all middle class means that it becomes very difficult to have nobody wants to be considered poor, means that you have a difficulty in having an explicit discussion about class issues. So, for instance, like when the president now talks about some of his quote unquote middle class tax breaks, right? Some of those are going to people, are basically transfer payments to people who aren't even paying, their income is so low they're not even paying taxes anyway. Those people aren't really middle class. I mean, they work. And so then you start to talk about, well, middle class values, right? Hard work, et cetera, et cetera. So or the kind of culture of middle class. You know, do you have a home? Do you have a dog, a wife, a nuclear family? So in some ways, because of all this, we don't really have, our language or lexicon of class is extraordinarily impoverished, for lack of a better term. And we have difficulty, right? John Edwards was the only person who really talked about poverty on the campaign, and we saw how far that got him, right? No one wants to think of themselves in the context of the U.S. as a wealthy nation. No one wants to think of themselves as poor. No one wants to think about other people as poor. So to wrap up, actually, Marxism has also been equally engaged, which is what we'll pick up on next Tuesday, through sort of revolutionary nationalism I talked about, but with Pan-Africanism and internationalism. Black Marxists have equally been concerned with anti-colonial struggles, the Caribbean, Africa, South Africa, and as well have been engaged in and focused on Latin America. Many of the Black Panthers exiled themselves for various times, like Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, and places like Cuba, et cetera, where they connected with socialist governments, et cetera. So I'm going to wrap up there. We will start the exam right on time. You guys should have plenty of time to finish it. Thank you, and I will see you on Thursday.